What if the most sacred women in ancient history, the pure goddesses on marble pedestals, were actually gatekeepers of rituals so explicit and disturbing that museums still sanitize the translations? Behind temple curtains, beyond children's mythology, lay ceremonies where devotion meant surrendering body and dignity to demands justified as cosmic necessity. Archaeologists have excavated the evidence, tablets, carvings, and sacred chambers that record practices too unsettling for standard textbooks. Across 30 cultures, the same pattern appears: goddesses who fused worship with humiliation, ecstasy with fear, power with violation. Welcome to 30 Most Perverted Ancient Goddesses and Their Twisted Demands. Now, we dig deeper. Picture this. The year is approximately 2100 BCE, and the ancient city of Uruk stretches across the Mesopotamian plain like a fever dream made of mud brick and human ambition. The ziggurat of Inanna rises above the city like a mountain torn from the earth and rebuilt according to divine geometry, its stepped sides catching the last rays of sunlight as evening prayers begin to echo from its sacred chambers. Torches flicker along corridors thick with the smoke of burning cedar and frankincense imported from Lebanon, at costs that could feed entire villages. The air itself seems to pulse with anticipation as hundreds of bodies move in synchronized rhythm through the temple complex. Priests in elaborate robes that cost more than most families earn in a lifetime. Priestesses whose cosmetics and jewelry display the accumulated wealth of a trading empire, and devotees whose nervous energy speaks to the profound psychological ordeal they're about to witness. This is the dwelling place of Inanna, goddess of love, goddess of war, an unknowing architect of what may be the most psychologically complex and systematically degrading religious ritual in recorded human history. The official story, the version carved into royal inscriptions and taught to children, paints her as civilization's divine patron, protector of kings, bringer of military victory, goddess of beauty and erotic desire, who ensures that crops grow, armies triumph, and the natural order continues in proper harmony. Mesopotamian hymns recovered from archaeological sites across Iraq and Iran praise her radiance, her power to transform barren landscapes into fertile gardens, her ability to make the strong tremble and the weak find courage. She appears on thousands of cylinder seals as a luminous figure, crowned with horns of divinity and radiating the kind of divine authority that made mortals fall prostrate when her name was spoken. Royal libraries contain epic poems celebrating her adventures, her wisdom, her essential role in maintaining cosmic balance. But when you dig deeper into the cuneiform archives, when you translate not just the public hymns and royal propaganda, but the private temple records, the ritual instruction manuals, the detailed accounts of what actually transpired during her most sacred ceremonies, you discover something that makes modern scholars reach for euphemisms and academic circumlocution. The descent of Inanna wasn't just mythological literature. It was a liturgical instruction manual for a ritual so invasive, so deliberately designed to shatter human dignity, that it reads like psychological warfare disguised as religious devotion. The sacred marriage ceremony, the hieros gamos, required nothing less than the complete ritual subordination of masculine authority to feminine divine power. But this wasn't symbolic submission expressed through poetry or ceremonial gestures. This was literal, physical, psychological domination performed in front of witnesses, who were required, not invited, required, to observe every moment of the transformation. Picture the scene: the most powerful man in the known world, the king who commands armies and controls the wealth of nations, stripped of his elaborate gold-threaded robes that normally announce his authority to anyone within sight. The regalia that makes him instantly recognizable as divine authority on earth, the crown, the ceremonial weapons, the jewelry that displays his connection to the gods, all removed piece by piece in a process that archaeological evidence suggests was deliberately prolonged and psychologically calculated. Oil glistens on his skin, applied by priestesses who recite scripts recovered from temple archives, words designed to transform him from sovereign ruler to supplicant petitioner, from the masculine authority that normally commands obedience to something approaching what we might recognize as a ritualized form of psychological prisoner. But here's what makes this particularly sophisticated as a system of control. Every gesture was choreographed according to religious necessity rather than political revolution. This wasn't rebellion against royal authority. It was the cosmic requirement for royal authority to prove itself worthy through submission to something greater. The crowd doesn't just watch, they must watch, because Inanna's power flows through witness, through the collective observation of authority, unmade and remade according to her divine specifications. Temple records describe the positioning of observers, the required responses, the specific phrases they must chant as the ritual progresses through its carefully orchestrated stages. Recent archaeological excavations at Uruk have uncovered chambers beneath the White Temple that confirm the literary accounts with disturbing precision. These aren't just rooms, they're purpose-built spaces designed specifically for the sacred marriage ceremony, with drainage systems that suggest the rituals involved more bodily fluids than academic translations typically acknowledge, with acoustic properties that would amplify certain sounds while muffling others. With architectural features that controlled sightlines and created specific types of psychological pressure through the manipulation of space itself. Clay tablets recovered from these chambers record not just the general outline of the ceremonies, but the precise words that must be spoken, the exact physical positions required, the specific ways the king's body must move and respond to demonstrate proper submission to the goddess's authority. These aren't poetic metaphors. They're technical manuals for the systematic dissolution of masculine political authority through ritualized erotic submission. But Inanna's genius, the innovation that made her system so devastatingly effective and so widely copied across the ancient world, was making vulnerability the price of power. You want to rule thousands of people? You must. First, surrender control over your own body. You want her divine favor to legitimize your authority? You earn it on your knees, quite literally, in ways that transform the private experience of sexual submission into public demonstration of cosmic hierarchy. You want the fertility of the land, the prosperity of your people, the success of your military campaigns. Then you accept that your masculinity, your dignity, your sense of autonomous selfhood become offerings laid on her altar, consumed by divine appetite that acknowledges no limits and respects no conventional boundaries. The psychological sophistication becomes clear when you realize that this wasn't a one-time ordeal that a king could endure and then forget. The sacred marriage was an annual requirement, repeated every year as agricultural and political necessity, with the understanding that failure to perform the ritual properly would result in cosmic disaster. Failed crops, military defeat, the collapse of social order itself. Every year, the most powerful man in the civilization had to return to that chamber beneath the temple and surrender everything that made him powerful to prove he was worthy of remaining powerful. Every year, his authority was contingent upon his willingness to be systematically stripped of authority in the most intimate and degrading ways possible. And once Mesopotamia established this template, power flowing through ritual subordination, through the eroticization of divine submission, through the transformation of sexual vulnerability into cosmic necessity, other cultures noticed. They studied it, they adapted it, they improved upon it, and they escalated it into forms that would make even Inanna's priests reach for stronger wine. The pattern was born in those torch-lit chambers beneath Uruk, desire, fear, and control braided into a single system that could justify anything and demand everything, as long as it was presented as divine necessity rather than human choice. The temple precinct at Dendera shimmers in the pre-dawn light of the Nile Valley, its massive limestone columns rising like a forest of stone trees, each one carved with the serene, cow-eared face of Hathor, gazing down with eyes that have witnessed 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. The morning air tastes of yeast and lotus blossoms as hundreds of priests move with practiced precision through the complex, arranging thousands of clay jugs filled with date wine fermented to dangerous potency and barley beer so strong it could knock a construction worker unconscious. The mathematical precision of their movements speaks to the deadly seriousness of what they're preparing. This isn't a casual celebration or a spontaneous festival. This is the annual festival of drunkenness, and what's about to unfold would make a modern college fraternity party look like a Methodist church picnic organized by particularly conservative grandmothers. But before we dive into the horror, let's establish what the official story wants you to believe about Hathor, because the contrast between public image and private reality reveals everything you need to know about how religious authority manipulates human psychology. Officially, according to the temple inscriptions that tourists read today, according to the mythology that gets taught in undergraduate Egyptology courses, Hathor embodies maternal gentleness, perfected into divine form. She's the golden cow mother who nurses pharaohs with milk that grants divine wisdom, goddess of music and joy, whose temples echo with the sweet sound of harps and sistrums, played by priestesses whose smiles never waver. She's the protector of women in childbirth, the divine midwife who ensures that Egyptian families continue to grow and prosper. Her temples throughout Egypt present this image with stunning consistency. Walls decorated with scenes of peaceful abundance, hieroglyphic inscriptions praising her nurturing care, statues showing her with the gentle face of an idealized mother whose love encompasses all of Egyptian civilization. Her priests smile serenely as they pour libations of milk and honey, speak in soft voices about divine love and maternal protection, and present themselves as servants of a goddess whose greatest pleasure comes from ensuring human happiness and prosperity. But when you dig deeper into the hieroglyphic archives, when you translate not just the public inscriptions, but the temple records that detail what actually transpired during Hathor's festivals, you discover a psychological and theological complexity that makes modern psychiatrists nervous, and religious scholars reach for euphemisms so academic they obscure the full horror of what we're dealing with. The Festival of Drunkenness wasn't a celebration of Hathor's gentleness. It was a ritualized reenactment of the myth where Hathor, transformed into her terrifying aspect as the lioness goddess Sekhmet, nearly exterminated the entire human species in a drunken rage that lasted days and left the Nile Valley flowing with blood instead of water. According to the destruction of mankind, preserved in multiple versions across Egyptian religious literature, Ra had grown tired of human rebellion and sent Hathor to punish humanity for its disobedience. But the goddess became so intoxicated by the act of slaughter, so drunk on human blood and the pleasure of unlimited destruction, that she couldn't stop killing even after she'd accomplished her divine mission. The other gods, watching the systematic extermination of their worshippers, realized they had created a problem that divine authority couldn't solve through normal means. Hathor had become too powerful, too intoxicated by violence, too lost in the ecstasy of cosmic destruction to respond to commands or reasoning. Their solution reveals the sophistication of Egyptian religious psychology. They couldn't stop Hathor directly, but they could trick her into stopping herself. They flooded the land with beer dyed red with ochre to mimic the blood she craved, so much beer that even a goddess would become too intoxicated to continue the slaughter that was rapidly eliminating her own worshipper base. The annual festival ritualized this near apocalypse through state-sponsored mass intoxication that transformed the entire civilization into willing participants in their own cosmic humiliation. Devotees weren't just encouraged to drink, they were religiously required to consume alcohol until they achieved what the temple texts call beautiful drunkenness, a level of complete loss of self-control that supposedly prevented Hathor from resuming the murderous rampage that had almost ended human history. Papyrus accounts from the festival, preserved in Egyptian archives that scholars still struggle to translate diplomatically, describe scenes that would violate health and safety regulations in every modern jurisdiction. Linen garments soaked in wine and vomit, sacred precincts echoing with uncontrolled laughter that morphs into hysterical sobbing without warning, devotees collapsing in pools of their own making, while priests solemnly declared their complete physical and psychological debasement pleasing to the goddess. But the archaeological evidence reveals details that make the written accounts seem almost restrained by comparison. Excavations at Dendera have uncovered drainage systems specifically designed to handle the massive quantities of bodily fluids produced by thousands of people drinking themselves into unconsciousness simultaneously. The temple complex includes medical facilities stocked with remedies for alcohol poisoning, hangover treatments, and medications for the injuries that resulted when intoxicated worshippers lost control of their physical coordination. The psychological sophistication of the festival becomes clear when you realize that Hathor demanded not just intoxication, but public degradation performed as religious duty. You weren't just getting drunk. You were surrendering your dignity, your rationality, your ability to function as a coherent human being in full view of your community, and doing it publicly, in her sacred space, because cosmic order required your humiliation as payment for the continued existence of the human species. Your hangover the next morning wasn't just physical discomfort that could be treated with water and rest. It was proof of piety, evidence that you had fulfilled your religious obligation to sacrifice your functional capacity as a human being to keep the world from ending. Your humiliation, the vomit-stained clothing, the memories of things you did while intoxicated that violated every standard of civilized behavior, the physical and psychological wreckage left by divinely mandated self-destruction, wasn't a regrettable side effect of religious celebration. It was the entire point, the offering that Hathor required to remain pacified. The festival transformed the threat of cosmic destruction into an annual exercise in voluntary self-destruction, proving that humans could be relied upon to destroy their own dignity rather than risk divine annihilation of their species. When a goddess asks you to lose control as proof of devotion, the next logical step in the theological evolution is a goddess who asks you to survive physical pain as evidence of spiritual purity. Spartan boys stand barefoot in the pre-dawn cold, their thin cloaks providing no protection from the wind that cuts across the Eurotas Valley. The altar of Artemis Orthia rises before them, ancient stone stained dark with generations of offerings. Not grain offerings, not wine, blood. The official mythology presents Artemis as the eternal virgin, the chaste huntress who protects youth and oversees coming-of-age ceremonies. Her silver bow never misses its target. Her deer run free in sacred groves. She embodies purity, untouchability, divine protection. Temple art depicts her as serenely beautiful, surrounded by woodland creatures who seek her benevolent shelter. Poets sing of her fierce independence, her rejection of male pursuit, her role as protector of young girls transitioning to womanhood. But the historical accounts from Pausanias, Plutarch, and other ancient historians reveal a ritual so brutal that even Romans, who weren't exactly squeamish about violence, found it disturbing. When Roman officials finally witnessed the diamastigosis firsthand, they attempted to ban it entirely, replacing it with theatrical performances. The Spartans revolted. Their goddess required real blood, not staged drama. The diamastigosis required teenage boys to endure ritual flogging at Artemis's altar until blood soaked the stone. Not symbolic whipping, not ceremonial taps with willow branches, full-force scourging that sometimes proved fatal. The whips were crafted specifically for maximum damage, leather thongs embedded with metal fragments and bone chips, designed to tear flesh with each strike. Priests watched carefully, not to prevent injury, but to ensure the boys showed no weakness, no crying, no flinching that might displease the virgin goddess. The ritual followed precise protocols developed over centuries. Boys were selected based on family lineage and physical condition. Only the strongest could survive what Artemis demanded. They fasted for days beforehand, purifying themselves through hunger. At dawn, they approached the altar naked except for a thin cloth around their waist, hands bound behind their backs to prevent any instinctive attempt at self-protection. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the actual altar, its limestone surface chemically analyzed and confirmed to bear traces of human blood dating back centuries. The grooves worn into the stone tell their own story, channels carved by countless bodies dragged across the rough surface. The museum placard tactfully calls it evidence of ritual activity. The boys who died there might have described it differently. Mothers stood in the crowd, watching their sons' backs open under the lash, forbidden to intervene. Some accounts describe women fainting from the sight of their children suffering, only to be revived and forced to continue watching. Spartan society measured a family's honor by how much pain their child could silently endure for Artemis. The goddess of purity demanded proof of devotion written in scars. Boys who collapsed were dragged away in shame. Those who endured earned the right to call themselves true Spartans, assuming they survived the blood loss and infection that often followed. The festival drew visitors from across the Greek world, horrified tourists who came to witness what civilized society had abandoned. Foreign observers noted the eerie silence that fell over the crowd during the beatings. No cheering, no encouragement, just the sound of leather striking flesh, and the occasional grunt of pain quickly suppressed. The goddess would accept nothing less than perfect stoic endurance. The perverse psychology becomes obvious. Masculinity and piety, tested through ritualized suffering, administered under the gaze of a virgin goddess who supposedly protected the very youth she demanded bleed for her. The contradiction was intentional. Artemis's protection came only through proving you could survive her violence. Her mercy required earning through agony. What makes this particularly chilling is how the Spartans rationalized the brutality. They claimed the ritual honored an ancient wooden statue of Artemis that once demanded human sacrifice. The flogging was supposedly a merciful compromise, severe pain instead of death. The goddess had graciously accepted a substitute offering, they insisted, even as boys continued dying at her altar. The ritual survived for over 8 centuries, ending only when Christianity finally displaced the old gods. By then, countless young bodies had fed the bloodthirsty virgin's appetite for proof that pain equals purity. Once you establish that pain proves purity, the next goddess takes that logic to its ultimate conclusion by demanding you abandon part of your body altogether. The Phrygian highlands echo with the sound of cymbals and wild flutes as processions snake toward cliffside shrines dedicated to Cybele, the Great Mother. Later, in Roman streets during the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood, that same music will accompany scenes so extreme that even the empire that perfected crucifixion found them difficult to stomach. Official imperial propaganda presented Cybele as Rome's protective mother goddess, bringer of fertility, guardian of the state. Her cult was officially sanctioned, her priests given honors, her festivals celebrated with state funding. Her massive temple on the Palatine Hill proclaimed her maternal benevolence to citizens and enemies alike. Statues depicted her crowned with towers, surrounded by lions, holding the cornucopia of abundance. Coins bore her image alongside promises of prosperity and protection. But literary sources, Catullus, Ovid, Apuleius, and others, record what actually transpired during her worship. The Galli, her dedicated priests, castrated themselves in ecstatic religious frenzy using sharp stones or ritual blades, then lived the remainder of their lives as eunuchs in her service. Catullus's poem 63 describes the horrific moment of realization when the religious ecstasy fades and the young man understands what he has done to himself in Cybele's name. Archaeological evidence supports the literary accounts. Votive reliefs show the characteristic dress and appearance of the Galli, and burial sites near Cybele's temples contain skeletal remains showing evidence of deliberate genital mutilation. Excavations in Rome, Asia Minor, and Gaul have uncovered ritual knives specifically designed for the procedure, bronze blades with ornate handles depicting Cybele's sacred symbols. The ritual unfolded during her spring festivals with terrifying predictability. The celebrations began innocuously enough, processions carrying Cybele's sacred black stone through the streets, followed by days of theatrical performances and public feasts. But as the Dies Sanguinis approached, the atmosphere grew increasingly frenzied. Musicians played without rest, their instruments designed to produce the disorienting, hypnotic rhythms that preceded religious ecstasy. Young men, caught up in the frenzy of drumming and dancing, would seize whatever sharp implement lay at hand and perform the irreversible act in full view of the celebrating crowd. Witnesses described the moment as simultaneously horrifying and sacred. Blood streaming down their legs as they held their severed genitals aloft, like trophies offered to their demanding mother. The crowd would erupt in approval, interpreting the mutilation as proof of divine favor. They would then run through the streets, their blood spattering the stones, until they reached the house of a woman who would provide them with female clothing, the garments they would wear for the rest of their lives. This wasn't random charity, but part of the ritual structure. Wealthy Roman matrons competed for the honor of clothing newly castrated priests, believing it brought Cybele's blessing on their households. The transformation was absolute and irreversible. The former men adopted female names, female dress, female mannerisms. They painted their faces, wore jewelry, spoke in artificially high voices, Roman law classified them as neither male nor female, but as a third category, permanently liminal beings belonging entirely to their goddess. Cybele's perverse demand was temporal as well as physical, not just your manhood, but your entire future. Every day afterward became a living reminder of what you'd surrendered in a moment of divine madness. The galley aged as outcasts, dependent on temple charity, forbidden to marry, unable to leave their goddess's service. Many suffered chronic health problems from their wounds. Some committed suicide years later when the full weight of their sacrifice became unbearable. The goddess of fertility claimed permanent ownership of your capacity to create life. The mother goddess made you forever her child, dependent, neutered, unable to father children of your own. The cruel irony was intentional. She who gave life to all demanded that her most devoted followers surrender their ability to create it. What makes this particularly disturbing is how the Romans rationalized the practice. They claimed the castration honored Cybele's mythical consort, Attis, who had similarly mutilated himself. The ritual reenacted cosmic drama, they insisted, transforming personal tragedy into religious theater. Roman citizens were forbidden from becoming Galli. The honor was reserved for foreigners and slaves, as if acknowledging that no civilized person should pay such a price for divine favor. And if Cybele demanded you give up your manhood, the next goddess on our list complicated things further by banning sexuality entirely in her sanctuary, even as her priests destroyed their bodies for her. The temple of Atargatis rises on a plateau above the Syrian plain, its walls reflecting in sacred pools where golden fish swim in lazy circles. Pilgrims approach carrying elaborate offerings, jewelry, fine cloth, precious oils, hoping to glimpse the sacred fish that no one may eat, hoping to understand the goddess whose beauty is matched only by her capacity for terrifying vengeance. Official inscriptions praise Atargatis as a fertility goddess and protectress of her city Hierapolis, bringer of prosperity and abundance. Her image appears on coins as a serene figure crowned with towers, blessing the harvests and protecting travelers. Temple propaganda described her as the divine mother who emerged from the waters to bring civilization to humanity. Her festivals drew thousands of worshippers seeking her blessings for marriages, childbirth, and agricultural success. But Lucian's detailed eyewitness account in On the Syrian Goddess reveals the psychological complexity beneath her worship. Writing in the 2nd century CE, Lucian documented what he witnessed during an extended stay at her temple. Rituals that combined fertility worship with sexual prohibition, abundance with deprivation, beauty with terror. The temple operated under rigid rules. Absolute sexual abstinence was required of all who served her, while visitors who violated the sanctuary's purity laws faced punishments that make modern religious guilt look gentle. Priests underwent ritual castration in frenzied ceremonies, then spent their lives as neither male nor female, devoted entirely to a goddess who embodied perfect feminine sexuality while demanding they renounce their own. The psychological torture was methodical. Atargatis was depicted as the ultimate sexual being, voluptuous, alluring, eternally fertile, yet her presence made sexuality itself forbidden. Temple art showed her emerging naked from primordial waters, her body perfect and desirable, displayed prominently where celibate priests conducted daily rituals while denying their most basic human drives. Yet the same goddess who demanded such strict sexual prohibition surrounded herself with priests who had voluntarily mutilated their own genitals in ecstatic ceremonies. The contradiction was deliberate, designed to create psychological tension that never resolved. Her beauty made desire inevitable. Her laws made that desire sinful. The cycle was inescapable. The sacred fish amplified this torment. These weren't ordinary carp, but specially bred specimens with scales that shimmered gold and silver in the temple pools. They were beautiful, abundant, and absolutely forbidden. Temple inscriptions record severe punishments for anyone caught even attempting to touch them. Flogging, exile, or worse. The fish swam freely in waters that pilgrims could see but never enter, embodying the abundance that Atargatis offered but perpetually withheld. Pilgrims would journey for hundreds of miles to reach her sanctuary, bringing their most precious possessions to offer at her altar. The temple complex deliberately overwhelmed visitors with beauty. marble columns reflected in still pools, incense burning in golden braziers, the sound of fountains creating an atmosphere of paradise. But every beautiful element came with restrictions, every gift with a price that couldn't quite be paid. They would stand at the pools watching her sacred fish, beautiful, untouchable creatures whose lives mirrored the impossible standards she set for human behavior. The fish represented everything tantalizing about the goddess herself, visible, desirable, forever beyond reach. The temple's economic structure reinforced this dynamic. Pilgrims paid substantial fees for accommodation, meals, and ritual participation. They purchased expensive offerings, commissioned votive inscriptions, hired priests to perform elaborate ceremonies on their behalf. Yet no amount of payment ever guaranteed divine satisfaction. Our goddess always demanded more, greater sacrifice, deeper commitment, higher standards of purity. The fish could swim freely but never be caught. The priests could serve intimately but never experience physical love. The pilgrims could worship fervently, but always fell short of her impossible purity. Archaeological excavations at Hierapolis have revealed the actual temple complex with its elaborate pools and drainage systems designed to maintain the sacred fish. Votive inscriptions record the offerings made to appease a goddess whose favor seemed perpetually just out of reach. Bone analysis confirms that temple personnel suffered from stress-related disorders and nutritional deficiencies, physical evidence of the psychological toll her worship extracted. Our goddess perfected the art of impossible standards. She made devotion itself a form of torment, always reaching for something that couldn't be grasped, always falling short of demands that couldn't be met. She transformed religious worship into psychological warfare, using beauty and promise to create desires that her own laws made impossible to fulfill. From Mesopotamia to Syria, Egypt to Asia Minor, the pattern is already undeniable. These goddesses demanded sex, pain, humiliation, and impossible obedience. But as we move deeper into other cultures and centuries, the goddesses don't become gentler, they scale up. In Sparta's secondary shrines, tucked away from the grand temples that attract tourists and foreign dignitaries, stands a smaller sanctuary where weapons and armor lie scattered before an altar dedicated to Aphrodite, but not the Aphrodite of romantic poetry, passionate love letters, or the sweet madness of desire that drives ordinary human hearts to distraction. This is Aphrodite Aurea, the armed goddess of state-mandated sexuality, where love wears bronze and sex serves the polis with the same disciplined efficiency that Spartan soldiers bring to military campaigns. The contrast with conventional Aphrodite worship could hardly be more stark or more psychologically revealing. The official Aphrodite celebrated throughout the Greek world embodies everything beautiful and personally fulfilling about romantic passion. She laughs with lovers among rose petals imported at enormous cost from distant lands, inspires poetry that makes young hearts flutter with anticipation of romantic fulfillment, and presides over the kind of spontaneous desire that transforms ordinary people into temporarily divine beings drunk on mutual attraction. Her traditional myths speak of golden girdles that enhance natural beauty, enchanted arrows that kindle love between souls destined for each other, and divine interventions that ensure true lovers overcome obstacles to find happiness in each other's arms. This is Aphrodite as cosmic matchmaker, ensuring that human relationships serve individual fulfillment and emotional satisfaction. But in Sparta, the goddess of love was systematically restructured to serve military and demographic objectives that had nothing to do with personal happiness or romantic compatibility. Inscriptional evidence discovered at her shrine sites reveals that vows made to Aphrodite Aurea bound couples not to romantic attachment or emotional fidelity, but to reproductive duty for the polis measured in terms of healthy male children capable of military service. Sexual relations were explicitly reconceptualized as military service performed by other means, with the same sense of duty, discipline, and service to state authority that Spartan warriors brought to battlefield combat. Love letters between couples preparing for marriage were systematically replaced with breeding contracts that specified reproductive obligations, genetic considerations, and state expectations for offspring production. Wedding ceremonies conducted under Aphrodite Area's authority included oaths sworn on spear points rather than flowers, with couples pledging to produce warriors rather than promising emotional fidelity or romantic devotion. The armor decorating her shrine wasn't metaphorical symbolism. Archaeological excavations have uncovered actual military equipment dedicated to the goddess by couples who had successfully fulfilled their civic obligation to produce strong children for Sparta's armies. But the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Spartan marriage customs reveals how completely Aphrodite Area had militarized the most intimate aspects of human relationship. On their wedding night, Spartan wives had their heads shaved in the style of young male soldiers and were dressed in men's clothing, supposedly to ease the psychological transition for husbands whose emotional and sexual experience had been shaped entirely by the masculine environment of military barracks where romantic relationships with women were unknown territory. The practice reveals the terrifying logic of a society that understood heterosexual intimacy as a form of duty so alien to normal male experience that it required psychological preparation to help soldiers adapt to sexual contact with beings whose gender they had been systematically trained to ignore or devalue. Romance was restructured as a form of duty-bound physical training, where emotional connection became subordinate to reproductive efficiency and state demographic requirements. The goddess of love became an officer in Sparta's population control department, ensuring that sexual pleasure served institutional interests rather than personal desire or individual fulfillment. When love wears armor and sex serves the state, the distinction between personal and political vanishes entirely. And when intimate relationships become instruments of government policy, the next logical step is a goddess who demands even more comprehensive control over human reproduction and family structure. Night falls over the Towfeet outside Carthage, and the air carries the faint scent of ash mixed with something sweeter, more troubling. Hundreds of small urns rest in carefully arranged rows, each marking a spot where something precious was given to Tanit, the maternal goddess whose protection came at the highest possible price. The official image presents Tanit as a maternal protectress, a celestial goddess crowned with the crescent moon, arms outstretched to embrace and protect her people. Carthaginian coins bear her gentle face. Public monuments praise her as the guardian of the city, the divine mother who ensures prosperity and safety. But the archaeological evidence from the Tophet tells a different story, one so disturbing that scholars still debate its full implications. The urns contain the cremated remains of infants and young children, accompanied by stelae bearing inscriptions that thank Tanit for accepting the offering. Over 20,000 burial urns have been excavated, spanning several centuries of Carthaginian history. The debate centers on whether these were children who died of natural causes and were then offered to the goddess, or whether they were deliberately sacrificed. Some scholars argue for infant mortality rates. Others point to the consistency of the age ranges and the ritual context as evidence of deliberate offering. What cannot be debated is the psychological reality. Whether through death or deliberate sacrifice, Carthaginian parents offered their children's lives to ensure Tanit's favor. The goddess of maternal protection demanded the most maternal sacrifice possible. Imagine being a parent in ancient Carthage, standing before Tanit's altar with the most precious thing you possess, believing that only by giving up what you love most can you secure divine protection for what remains. The stelae record their gratitude. To Our Lady Tanit, face of Baal, and to Lord Baal Hammon, that which our mouth vowed to give when we were in danger. The archaeological record preserves their obedience, but not their anguish. Even if we accept the most conservative interpretation that these were children who died naturally and were then offered to the goddess, the practice reveals a religious system where divine favor required parents to transform their deepest grief into an act of worship. The goddess who promised to protect families demanded that families demonstrate their devotion by surrendering their future. Even if we soften the conclusions, the anxiety is clear. Some offerings cannot be walked back. Firelight flickers in the longhouse as winter wind howls across the Scandinavian landscape. The vulva, the magic worker, prepares for a cedar ritual, donning furs and feathers while warriors watch with a mixture of fascination and shame. They need her magic to see the future, to control the weather, to bind their enemies, but they despise her for possessing the power they lack. Freya appears in Norse mythology as a goddess of love and beauty. sister to Freyr, dwelling in the gleaming hall of Sessrumnir, where she welcomes half of those who die in battle. She drives a chariot pulled by cats, wears a magnificent necklace called Brisingamen, and embodies feminine allure and fertility. But the Lokasenna reveals a darker aspect of her worship. When Loki hurls accusations at the assembled gods, he specifically taunts Freya and Odin for practicing cider magic, a form of sorcery associated with women, and considered deeply shameful for men to perform. The perverse demand Freya made was psychological. To access her most powerful magic, male practitioners had to engage in activities that Norse society considered utterly degrading to masculine honor. They had to cross-dress, adopt feminine mannerisms, and perform rituals that their own culture classified as ergi, unmanly, shameful, sexually deviant. Odin himself, the All-Father, submitted to this humiliation to learn the secrets of satyr. The king of the gods allowed himself to be feminized, mocked, and sexually compromised to gain Freya's magical knowledge. Archaeological evidence of satyr practice includes graves with ambiguous gender markers, biological males buried with feminine grave goods, or with ritual implements that suggest they practiced magic in ways that violated social norms. Freya's genius was making power contingent upon shame. You could access her magic, but only by accepting social death, by becoming something your own culture considered contemptible. She offered ultimate magical power at the cost of masculine identity. Every spell you cast reminded you of what you'd sacrificed to learn it. In the North, shame was a kind of leash the gods themselves pulled, and when the gods model submission to impossible standards, their human worshippers learn to expect even less mercy. Babylon's streets buzz with nervous conversation as women from across Mesopotamia gather outside the Temple of Ishtar, known here by her aspect name, Mylitta. They carry perfumes and jewelry, dress in their finest clothing, but their faces show anxiety rather than anticipation. According to Herodotus, each woman must remain here until a stranger chooses her for ritualized sexual service to the goddess. Modern scholars heavily criticize Herodotus's sensationalized account as Greek propaganda designed to make foreign cultures appear barbarous. However, Mesopotamian religious texts do document forms of sacred sexuality connected to Ishtar sur Mylitta worship, though the exact practices remain debated. Cuneiform tablets from various temple archives reference Naditu priestesses who served Ishtar in celibacy, Harimtu, women associated with the goddess, and temple singers whose duties included forms of ritualized intimacy. The archaeological record confirms that sexuality was integrated into religious practice in ways that would astonish modern worshippers. What we can establish is that Mesopotamian religion treated sexual activity as a form of divine service, not personal choice. Whether through temporary temple service or lifelong dedication, the goddess claimed authority over her followers' most intimate experiences. Temple account records show payments made to various categories of religious personnel, including those whose duties clearly involved physical intimacy. The goddess didn't simply bless sexual relationships, she commodified them, regulated them, and profited from them. The perverse logic becomes clear when you realize that Mylitta made sexuality itself a form of taxation. Your body became legal tender in transactions with the divine. Personal desire was subordinated to religious obligation. Ishtar, Mylitta, represented the institutional control of human sexuality, the transformation of the most intimate human experience into a duty owed to supernatural authority. The Greeks didn't invent erotic worship. They translated it into their own idiom. And when they did, they discovered ways to make shame itself a source of divine power. The Eleusinian countryside outside Athens grows quiet as thousands of initiates gather from across the Greek world to prepare for mysteries that cannot be spoken aloud. Religious experiences so profound and transformative that revealing their details carries the death penalties enforced by Athenian law with ruthless efficiency. But before the life-changing revelations begin, before the cosmic secrets are unveiled, there's an unexpected interlude, one involving a goddess whose very name makes modern scholars reach for euphemisms and whose central role in sacred drama would never make it into family-friendly mythology collections. In the sanitized version of the Demeter myth, taught in introductory classics courses, the grieving grain goddess searches desperately across the known world for her stolen daughter Persephone, refusing to eat or smile or allow the earth to produce food until Kor returns safely from the underworld, where Hades has claimed her as his unwilling bride. The earth grows barren, crops fail, humanity faces starvation on a global scale. Even the gods themselves begin to fear the consequences of Demeter's eternal mourning, understanding that divine grief threatens to end human civilization entirely. But archaeological discoveries of terracotta figurines throughout the Mediterranean reveal how the ancients actually understood and depicted the resolution of Demeter's cosmic depression. The answer wasn't found through diplomatic negotiation, therapeutic intervention, or divine counseling designed to help the goddess process her trauma in healthy ways. Enter Baubo, a goddess whose anatomical configuration defied every conventional understanding of how bodies should be organized for public presentation. Her torso was her face, her vulva grinned where a mouth should be, and her outrageously obscene gestures and displays finally shocked Demeter out of her grief-induced paralysis and made the cosmic mother laugh for the first time since her daughter's abduction. The archaeological evidence is unmistakable and impossible to interpret charitably. Female figurines, where the torso opens like a flower to reveal exaggerated genitalia, often with legs positioned to frame the central anatomical display with the same compositional care that artists normally reserve for displaying beautiful faces or religious symbols. These weren't private curiosities hidden away in wealthy collectors' cabinets or treated as pornographic artifacts separated from legitimate religious practice. They were official religious objects, blessed by priests venerated in public ceremonies, and treated with the same reverence normally accorded to images of Zeus or Athena, or other respectable deities whose worship didn't require explicit genital display as central theological component. Baubo's revolutionary healing method involved the systematic transformation of public indecency into sacred comedy that operated according to psychological principles modern therapists would recognize but never dare to implement. She forced Demeter to confront and laugh at what polite society insisted must remain hidden, making private anatomical reality public and transforming shame into absurdly funny divine performance art. But the theological sophistication becomes clear when you understand that Baubo's intervention wasn't random shock therapy or crude attempt to distract the grieving goddess through inappropriate humor. Her method was precisely calibrated psychological operation. Healing trauma required the complete dissolution of social boundaries that normally separate acceptable from unacceptable, sacred from profane, dignified from ridiculous. Grief, according to Baubo's therapeutic philosophy, could only be broken by laughter that violated every conventional standard of appropriate behavior, and that transformative laughter could only emerge through the systematic destruction of taboos that normally prevent people from acknowledging the absurd, funny, undignified reality of human physical existence. Initiates into the Eleusinian mysteries witnessed ritual reenactments of Baubo's intervention during the most sacred religious ceremonies in ancient Greece, where temporary abandonment of religious dignity restored cosmic order through bawdy comedy that somehow proved more spiritually effective than conventional prayer, sacrifice, or theological instruction. Ancient grief counseling was fundamentally different from modern therapeutic practice. Instead of talking through trauma in private sessions designed to preserve dignity, you watch sacred clowns perform explicit genital comedy in public religious ceremonies until you remembered how to smile and laugh and connect with other human beings despite devastating personal loss. Baubo proved that divine healing requires public humiliation, that sacred laughter emerges from obscene violation of social boundaries, and that shame can be weaponized as therapeutic tool more powerful than conventional comfort or consolation. 7 gates guard the entrance to the underworld, each one designed with architectural and psychological precision to strip away another layer of dignity, another piece of constructed identity, another fragment of the illusion that individual autonomy can survive encounters with absolute divine authority, until even gods arrive before Ereshkigal's obsidian throne, naked, powerless, and reduced to the essential vulnerability, that defines the relationship between mortal consciousness and cosmic reality. The Queen of the Dead doesn't simply rule over the afterlife as a cosmic civil servant managing bureaucratic transitions between life and death. She authored what may be the most psychologically sophisticated domination ritual in ancient literature, a systematic deconstruction of selfhood that reveals the illusory nature of every identity we construct to protect ourselves from the knowledge of our ultimate powerlessness. Officially, according to the theological texts that present her public function to ordinary worshippers, Ereshkigal serves as queen of the underworld, sister to Ishtar, ruler of the land of no return, who maintains cosmic order by keeping the dead in their proper realm and preventing the dangerous confusion that would result if the boundaries between life and death became permeable. But the descent of Inanna, preserved in multiple versions across Mesopotamian literature, reveals the deliberate psychological architecture behind her underworld domain. When Ishtar descends to challenge her sister's authority in a cosmic power struggle that threatens to upset the fundamental order of existence, she must remove something at each successive gate. Her crown at the first, establishing that royal authority means nothing in Ereshkigal's domain. Her jewelry at the second, proving that wealth and status symbols become irrelevant when confronting ultimate authority. Her royal robes at the third, demonstrating that the social conventions that define identity in the upper world dissolve under absolute divine scrutiny. The process continues through 7 gates, each demanding the surrender of another aspect of constructed selfhood, until Ishtar arrives at Ereshkigal's throne completely exposed, naked not just of clothing, but of every external marker that distinguished her as goddess of love, queen of heaven, or anything other than vulnerable consciousness stripped of protective illusions. The stripping protocol wasn't practical necessity. Dead souls don't require protection from weather or physical threats. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to systematically destroy everything that constituted identity, status, and self-concept in the world above, proving that all social construction is ultimately arbitrary when confronted with cosmic authority that recognizes no conventional boundaries or limitations. Cuneiform tablets recovered from temple archives describe the ritual procedures in technical detail that reads like instruction. Manual for psychological demolition, how each garment must be removed, in what order, with what ceremonial acknowledgement of its surrender, how the supplicant must kneel, stand, and move through each gate, how even gods themselves must submit to this process of absolute exposure that transforms divine beings into naked petitioners begging for mercy from authority greater than their own. Ereshkigal's perverse demand was ontological rather than simply physical, comprehensive surrender of status, clothing, dignity, social identity, and ultimately the fundamental illusion of autonomous selfhood that allows conscious beings to believe they possess independent existence, separate from the cosmic forces that created and sustain them. You entered her realm carrying every assumption about who you thought you were, every belief about your importance, power, and special status that defined your sense of self. You approached her throne as nobody at all, just naked consciousness confronting the reality that individual identity is temporary construction that dissolves under absolute scrutiny. The goddess of death proved that dying wasn't the most terrifying experience available to conscious beings. Being systematically stripped of everything that made you recognizable to yourself while remaining alive to witness the process. That was the true horror of ultimate divine encounter. In temples scattered across the contested borderlands between Egyptian and Syrian spheres of influence, where political authority shifts with each military campaign and cultural identity becomes fluid as desert sand, a goddess stands naked on a lion, with serpents writhing in her upraised hands, her body displayed without shame, concealment, or apology for the scandal her image creates among visitors accustomed to more modest forms of religious art. This is Kadesh, whose very name means holy, but whose worship represents the most systematic militarization of female sexuality in the ancient Mediterranean world, a theological innovation that transforms the human body from private possession into public weapon deployed in service of cosmic and political authority. The archaeological record reveals the sophisticated network of cult sites dedicated to Kadesh, stretching from the Nile Delta through the Levantine coast, each temple serving as both religious center and political statement about the nature of divine authority and its relationship to human sexuality. These weren't hidden shrines where deviant practices were conducted in secrecy. They were major public religious centers that received official state support and drew pilgrims from across the region. Officially, according to the royal inscriptions and temple hymns that present the acceptable public face of her worship, Kadesh represented the sacredness of human sexuality, divine approval of erotic desire, the cosmic blessing that transformed physical pleasure from animal instinct into spiritual experience. Egyptian religious texts discovered in her temple archives praise her as a bringer of life and joy, who ensures that marriages produce children and that communities prosper through the divine energy that flows from properly sanctified sexual relationships. But iconographic analysis of her cult images reveals how completely she weaponized feminine sexuality as an instrument of state power and religious control. Unlike other ancient goddesses whose nudity is suggested through translucent drapery or artistic convention that preserves modesty while acknowledging divine fertility, Kadesh's body becomes the central focus of her iconography, displayed with the same aggressive confidence as the weapons carried by war gods or the lion she stands upon, as demonstration of her dominance over natural forces. The papyrus documents recovered from her temple sites describe ritual practices that mirror her artistic representation with disturbing precision. Devotees, both priests and ordinary worshippers, honored Kadesh through ceremonial nudity that transformed private sexuality into public religious performance regulated by temple authorities and overseen by state officials who understood the political implications of controlling access to divine sexual power. Temple reliefs from multiple sites show processions where participants progressively shed their clothing as they approach the goddess's inner sanctuary, transforming the journey toward divine encounter into increasingly elaborate displays of physical vulnerability that culminates in complete exposure before the goddess whose own nakedness serves as both model and command. The psychological sophistication of the system becomes clear when you realize that Kadesh demanded her followers transform their bodies into public declarations of her power over the most intimate aspects of human experience. Private sexuality, the realm of personal choice, individual desire, romantic attachment, was systematically reclaimed as public religious spectacle where divine authority could monitor, judge, and regulate human relationships according to cosmic principles determined by priestly interpretation. Bronze figurines recovered from domestic archaeological contexts throughout the region show that Kadesh's influence extended far beyond temple walls into ordinary households, where families kept naked goddess images as everyday religious objects that normalized the public display of sexuality as form of devotional practice that children would absorb as natural aspect of religious life. But the most revealing evidence comes from administrative documents that record the economic dimensions of her worship. Temple accounts that detail payments made to various categories of religious personnel, whose duties included the provision of sexual services to pilgrims, tax records that show state revenue derived from temple activities, legal documents that regulate the terms under which bodies could be offered to the goddess, and the compensation provided to those whose sexuality served religious purposes. Her perverse innovation was bureaucratic as well as theological, the systematic transformation of personal intimacy into state-regulated religious commodity, where individual bodies became assets in divine economy controlled by temple and political authorities who profited from human sexuality disguised as cosmic service. Kadesh proved that when religious and political authority collaborate to endorse desire, the line between personal choice and state control doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely, replaced by systems where human sexuality serves institutional purposes that have nothing to do with individual welfare or spiritual development. Across the coastal cities of the ancient Levant, from Sidon and Tyre to Cyprus and Carthage, Astartes temples echo with sounds that challenge every conventional boundary between sacred and profane, between worship and warfare, between religious devotion and military preparation. These aren't the gentle harmonies you expect from divine worship. They're the rhythmic clash of weapons being blessed alongside wedding vows, where soldiers and lovers make identical oaths to a goddess who sees no meaningful difference between conquest on the battlefield and domination in the bedroom. The Ugaritic texts discovered at Ras Shamra, decoded by archaeologists who initially couldn't believe what they were translating, reveal Astarte as perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated fusion of violence and sexuality in ancient religious literature. She doesn't simply preside over warfare and romance as separate divine portfolios managed by the same cosmic authority. She operates according to theological logic that makes violence and intimacy interchangeable expressions of the same fundamental drive toward domination and submission. Phoenician inscriptions found throughout the Mediterranean reveal the geographical scope of her influence, from coastal Lebanon to the trading colonies of Spain, from the islands of Cyprus to the North African settlements that would eventually challenge Rome itself. This wasn't localized cult worship. This was religious franchise operation that adapted core theological principles to local political and military circumstances, while maintaining essential doctrinal consistency across vast distances and cultural differences. Archaeological evidence from Cyprus and other major Astarte cult sites reveals the material reality of her worship through temple deposits that mix weapons and erotic artifacts with disturbing precision. Bronze spear points are found alongside clay phalli in the same votive offerings. Armor fragments are intermingled with cosmetic containers in donations that suggest her worshippers understood military equipment and beauty supplies as serving identical divine purposes. But the most revealing archaeological discoveries come from temple workshops that manufactured both military equipment and ritual objects used in sexual ceremonies, operated by the same craftsmen using the same techniques, and blessed by the same priests according to religious protocols that made no distinction between preparing for war and preparing for intimate encounters. Administrative records recovered from her temple complexes detail the training regimens required for her priests, who were expected to demonstrate equal proficiency with sword and seduction techniques, battlefield tactics, and bedroom strategies. These weren't separate skill sets managed by different religious personnel. They were complementary aspects of the same divine service that required practitioners to master violence and sexuality as expressions of unified cosmic authority. Temple account documents record payments for instruction in both military techniques and sexual practices, provided to the same religious personnel, suggesting that Astarte's priests understood their divine service as requiring competency in activities that modern sensibilities would consider completely incompatible with religious vocation. The psychological sophistication of her theological system becomes clear when you analyze the oath formulas preserved in inscriptions dedicated to her worship. Vows made to Astarte bound devotees to serve her in whatever capacity she demanded, leading armies into battle or satisfying the sexual needs of temple visitors, conquering enemy territories or seducing political opponents, demonstrating valor in combat, or providing intimate services that served political intelligence-gathering purposes. The language of these oaths reveals how completely her worship fused conquest and seduction into single divine mandate. Soldiers swore to serve her through victory over enemies and mastery over lovers using identical terminology, while courtesans dedicated their sexual services using vocabulary borrowed from military conquest that made bedroom encounters indistinguishable from battlefield victories. But Astarte's most perverse innovation was psychological. She taught her followers that domination was domination regardless of context, that the skills required for successful warfare could be applied directly to sexual relationships and vice versa. Military strategy became erotic technique. Sexual conquest mirrored battlefield victory. The goddess who governed both domains demonstrated that violence and intimacy were simply different expressions of the same fundamental drive toward power over others. What happens when you swear allegiance to a goddess who controls both your battlefield performance and your bedroom activities? You lose the ability to distinguish between making love and making war, between intimate relationships and military campaigns, between romantic attachment and territorial conquest. And when those psychological distinctions collapse under divine authority that refuses to recognize conventional boundaries, the next logical step in theological evolution is a goddess who takes this fusion of power and desire to its ultimate expression through the systematic integration of ritual purity and erotic sophistication. In the great fire temples of the Persian Empire, from the royal sanctuary at Persepolis to the frontier outposts that guard the edges of Achaemenid territory, priests pour sacred water from golden vessels while burning incense that carries the scent of roses, jasmine, and saffron through chambers designed to overwhelm the senses with evidence of imperial wealth and divine favor. They prepare to honor Anahita, the goddess of waters and fertility, whose worship demonstrates the most sophisticated fusion of sensuality and religious purity ever devised by human civilization. This isn't the simple opposition between sacred and profane that characterizes most ancient religious systems. This is theological engineering that makes sensuality itself a form of purification, that transforms erotic desire into cosmic cleansing agent, that proves sexual sophistication and spiritual refinement can be identical rather than contradictory aspects of the same divine experience. Avestan hymns, preserved in the sacred literature of Zoroastrianism, praise Anahita as the divine cleanser of men's seed and women's wombs, the purifier of royal lineages who ensures that fertility flows through legitimate channels blessed by cosmic authority rather than polluted by human desire that lacks divine sanction. But these aren't euphemistic references to modest fertility blessings. They're technical descriptions of goddess whose divine portfolio includes the direct regulation of human reproductive activities according to religious protocols that make sexual experience itself subject to priestly oversight. Greek accounts written by visitors to Persian territory during the height of the Achaemenid Empire describe elaborate temple statues of Anahita dressed in golden robes and jewels that represented the accumulated wealth of nations. Artistic representations so beautiful and so sensually charged that foreign observers found themselves aroused by stone carvings in ways that challenged their assumptions about the relationship between religious art and physical desire. But analysis of ritual texts preserved in priestly archives reveals the psychological complexity that made Anahita's worship so different from anything else in the ancient world. She didn't suppress sexual desire in favor of spiritual purity, as most religious systems attempted to do. She refined it, channeled it, and made it exponentially more powerfully erotic through elaborate restriction, ceremony, and theological sophistication that transformed ordinary physical pleasure into cosmic experience. Her temples functioned as centers of what we might recognize as sacred sexology, institutions where physical desire was studied, categorized, and optimized according to religious principles that treated human sexuality as divine technology requiring proper training, maintenance, and ceremonial application to achieve maximum spiritual and physical effectiveness. Priests trained in her service maintained detailed records, all of fertility cycles, sexual techniques, and reproductive success rates that were analyzed according to astrological principles and theological doctrine to determine the most spiritually beneficial approaches to physical intimacy. These weren't simply fertility calendars. They were comprehensive databases of human sexual experience, subjected to religious analysis that made bedroom activities subject to the same systematic study normally reserved for astronomy or mathematics. The goddess demanded that her followers approach sexuality with the same disciplined attention, technical precision, and ceremonial reverence they brought to prayer, sacrifice, and other formal religious activities. Spontaneous desire was considered spiritually inferior to liturgical precision that transformed sexual encounter into elaborate religious ceremony requiring preparation, proper technique, and divine authorization. But Anahita's most perverse innovation was making sexual calculation intensely erotic through religious authority that treated precise ceremonial performance as the highest form of spiritual and physical sophistication. She proved that desire becomes exponentially more powerful when filtered through religious bureaucracy that makes pleasure contingent upon proper training, appropriate timing, and ceremonial correctness determined by priestly authority. The psychological sophistication becomes clear when you realize that her worship made spiritual purity and sexual expertise interdependent aspects of the same cosmic system. You couldn't achieve religious advancement without mastering erotic techniques, and you couldn't develop sexual sophistication without spiritual training that made physical pleasure serve divine purposes. Purity and desire weren't opposites in her theological system. They were business partners in cosmic enterprise that made spiritual refinement and erotic mastery mutually reinforcing aspects of unified religious practice. And when purity learns to profit from passion in this sophisticated manner, the next goddess shows how that divine partnership can be pushed to its ultimate artistic and theological expression. In rural shrines across the Indian subcontinent, stone sculptures present an image that stops visitors in their tracks. A female figure in the position of childbirth, her head replaced by a lotus blossom, her body explicitly displaying the source of life itself. This is Laja Gauri, whose very existence challenges every assumption about religious propriety and conventional divine representation. Archaeological surveys have documented hundreds of these sculptures, dating from the medieval period through modern times, found in village temples and rural sacred sites scattered across Maharashtra, Karnataka, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. The iconography is unmistakable and deliberately provocative. The goddess squats in birth position, her yoni prominently displayed, her identity centered entirely on her reproductive function. Some variations show her flanked by elephants or lions, symbols of royal power, suggesting that fertility itself was viewed as the ultimate sovereign force. The geographical distribution of Laja Gauri sculptures reveals fascinating patterns. In Maharashtra's Deccan region, she appears most frequently in drought-prone areas where agricultural fertility was literally a matter of survival. In Karnataka's temple complexes, she's often positioned near water sources, wells, tanks, and streams, linking her worship to the agricultural cycles that sustained entire communities. This strategic placement wasn't accidental. It reflected deep cultural understanding of fertility as encompassing both human reproduction and agricultural abundance. Folk traditions explain the lotus head as a symbol of consciousness rooted in fertility rather than rational thought. Unlike goddesses whose power flows from their faces, voices, or symbolic weapons, Laja Gauri's divinity emanates entirely from her capacity to create life. The lotus, emerging from muddy water to bloom in pristine beauty, became the perfect metaphor for birth itself, transformation through what others might consider base or dirty processes. Rural devotees, primarily women, but increasingly including men seeking family blessings, offer prayers for fertility, safe childbirth, and family prosperity. The explicit nature of the imagery isn't considered shocking or inappropriate. It's celebrated as the most honest representation of divine creative power. Offerings typically include red flowers, particularly hibiscus and roses, coconuts symbolizing the womb, and rice representing abundance. During harvest festivals, entire villages gather at Laja Gauri shrines to thank her for successful crops and pray for continued prosperity. Historical records from medieval temple inscriptions reveal that wealthy merchants and even royalty patronized Laja Gauri temples, suggesting her worship transcended class boundaries. This royal patronage indicates that explicit fertility worship wasn't marginalized as folk religion, but recognized as legitimate spiritual practice deserving institutional support. The theological implications are profound. Laja Gauri's perverse demand to conservative sensibilities was radical honesty. Confront explicit female sexuality as life-giving force rather than something shameful to be hidden. She insisted that the source of life deserved reverence, not concealment. In doing so, she challenged patriarchal religious structures that sought to control and sanitize feminine power. Her headlessness wasn't a disfigurement or artistic oversight. It was a deliberate theological statement. In a culture that increasingly prioritized modesty and covered sexuality under layers of social propriety, she declared that reproductive power deserved to be seen, honored, and explicitly celebrated. The absence of facial features meant devotees couldn't focus on conventional beauty or individual identity. They were forced to confront fertility itself as divine essence. Modern feminist scholars have noted how Laja Gauri represents one of the few goddess traditions where female sexuality isn't filtered through male desire or romantic narrative. She exists purely as creative force, demanding recognition of women's reproductive labor as sacred work deserving divine status. The goddess without a face made fertility itself the face of the divine, insisting that life's most fundamental process couldn't be hidden behind veils of false modesty. From castration to child sacrifice to explicit fertility worship, we've traced a line across millennia and continents. This isn't scattered cultural weirdness. It's a global grammar of control written in flesh and fear, replicated from Mesopotamia to India because it works. The pattern is undeniable. These goddesses demanded sex, pain, humiliation, and impossible obedience. But just when you think you've seen every way a goddess can claim human dignity, the final set of goddesses shows how entire empires were willing to go even further. On the battlefield of Kurukshetra, as described in Hindu scripture, Kali dances among severed heads, her dark skin glistening with blood, her necklace of skulls swaying as she moves. 4 arms hold different weapons: sword, trident, severed head, bowl to catch the blood. Her tongue lolls out, tasting the destruction she's created, and her foot rests on Shiva's chest, demonstrating that even the cosmic destroyer must submit to her terrible power. The Devi Mahatmya describes how Kali emerged from Durga's forehead during cosmic battle, born from divine fury to combat demons that ordinary gods couldn't defeat. Her weapons cut through evil, but they also intoxicate her with violence until she becomes as dangerous to the innocent as to the guilty. But tantric traditions reveal the theological sophistication beneath her apparently savage worship. Kali represents the dissolution of ego through confrontation with absolute terror. Devotees meditate on her terrifying form, not to become violent, but to move beyond fear itself. Her temples, like the famous Kali Ghat in Kolkata, historically conducted animal sacrifices that fed both goddess and community. The ritualized violence served multiple functions: honoring the goddess, providing protein for devotees, and psychologically preparing warriors for battle. Kings would invoke Kali before military campaigns, understanding that her blessing came through the willingness to embrace rather than avoid the horrible realities of warfare. She didn't prettify violence with noble rhetoric. She demanded that her followers face killing honestly. Archaeological evidence from medieval Indian battlefields shows that Kali worship flourished in regions of constant military conflict, where survival required the psychological capacity to commit and witness acts that would traumatize peaceful populations. Her perverse demand was philosophical: liberation through confrontation with violence, enlightenment through the embrace of what civilized society taught people to fear most. Kali offered spiritual freedom to those willing to pay its full psychological price. She proved that some forms of transcendence require you to become temporarily monstrous. When a goddess dances on corpses, she tells you something important about the world she rules, and about the people desperate enough to seek her protection. In Tenochtitlan's Templo Mayor, Aztec priests perform the daily ritual that keeps the sun rising and the world from ending. They hold obsidian knives over prisoners stretched across stone altars, their blood flowing into drains that lead directly into the earth. Below, carved in the temple's foundation, Tlaltekutli opens her massive jaws, ready to devour what sustains her. Aztec creation mythology describes Tlaltekutli as a primordial earth monster whose body was torn apart by the gods to create the physical world. Every mountain is a piece of her flesh, every valley a wound that still bleeds. The earth itself is alive, hungry, and requires constant nourishment to prevent her from reassembling and destroying creation. The Codex Borgia and other Mesoamerican manuscripts show Tlaltekutli with mouths at every joint, her elbows, knees, and other body parts all capable of devouring offerings. She doesn't simply have one appetite, but countless hungers that must be simultaneously satisfied. Archaeological excavation at the Templo Mayor has uncovered mass burial sites containing the remains of sacrifice victims, their bones showing the ritual cut marks that delivered their blood to Tlaltekutli's altars. The physical evidence confirms what the Spanish conquistadors found so difficult to believe: an entire civilization organized around feeding a goddess. But Tlaltekutli's demand wasn't random cruelty. Aztec theology taught that the earth monster had already sacrificed her own body to create the world where humans could live. The blood offerings weren't payments to a tyrant. They were reciprocal gifts to a goddess who had given everything first. The perverse logic becomes clear when you realize that Tlaltekutli made guilt the foundation of cosmic order. Every sunrise existed because someone died for it. Every harvest grew from soil watered with human blood. Every day of ordinary life depended on extraordinary violence. Your body wasn't your own property. It was rent paid to keep reality functioning. The earth monster's hunger transformed every human being into a potential mortgage payment on existence itself. Across an ocean from the Mediterranean, the same divine mathematics: blood for stability, death for life, human sacrifice as cosmic maintenance fee. And when an entire civilization accepts that cosmic order requires daily murder, the next goddess shows how that acceptance changes everything about how power operates. In the rainforests of the Yucatan, Maya scribes record the contradictory nature of Ixchel in codices that survive to puzzle modern archaeologists. She appears as both a young woman crowned with flowers and an aged crone surrounded by symbols of destruction: flood, disease, death. The same goddess who assists in childbirth also sends the hurricanes that destroy entire cities. Maya mythology presents Ixchel as the cosmic weaver, the goddess whose loom creates the fabric of reality itself. She controls the rains that bring life to crops and the floods that wash away settlements. Her temple at Cozumel attracted pilgrims from across Mesoamerica, seeking her aid in childbirth, medicine, and divination. But codical analysis reveals the theological complexity that made her so terrifying to worship. Ixchel didn't simply have good and bad moods. She operated according to a cosmic logic where creation and destruction were the same process viewed from different angles. The Dresden Codex shows her pouring water from a jar, but whether that water brings fertility or devastation depends entirely on her cosmic calculations, not human merit or behavior. She might save your child during birth and then drown your village the next season, following a divine arithmetic too complex for mortal comprehension. Archaeological evidence from Maya sites shows that Ixchel's temples were often built near both birthing centers and flood control engineering projects. Communities needed her help with both life and death, blessing and catastrophe, often simultaneously. Her perverse demand was trust in the face of cosmic arbitrariness. You had to worship a goddess who could save and destroy you according to principles you could never understand or predict. Ixchel offered no guarantees, no contracts, no reliable exchange of devotion for protection. She demanded faith in a universe where your midwife could also be your executioner. Maya civilization learned to live with radical uncertainty as a theological principle. When your protector goddess can also be your destroyer, devotion becomes a form of sophisticated anxiety management. And if uncertainty can be weaponized into worship, the next goddess shows how that uncertainty can be used to justify any degree of violence. At the sacred mountain of Coatepec, the Aztec creation myth unfolds in blood and terror. Coatlicue, the earth goddess whose skirt writhed with living serpents, becomes pregnant through a ball of feathers that falls from the sky. Her existing children, the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui and the stars, plot to murder her for this mysterious pregnancy. But from her womb bursts Huitzilopochtli, the war god, fully armed and ready to dismember his siblings. The massive stone sculpture of Coatlicue, housed in Mexico's National Museum, still stops visitors cold, a figure wearing a skirt of writhing serpents, a necklace of severed hands and hearts, her head replaced by two fanged snake skulls. This isn't art designed to inspire devotional feelings. It's theological terrorism carved in stone. Aztec mythology describes how Coatliceu's pregnancy represented the cosmic principle that creation requires destruction. New life can only emerge through the death of what came before. Motherhood becomes indistinguishable from cosmic violence. The ritual implications were staggering. Women in labor called upon Coatliceu's protection, but they understood that childbirth might literally require someone's death. If not their own, then potentially their infants, or someone offered in sacrifice to ensure safe delivery. Codicial evidence shows that Coatlicue's festivals included mock battles where participants reenacted the cosmic family massacre, with the victory of new life over old always requiring actual bloodshed. Archaeological findings from Aztec birthing sites include obsidian knives and evidence of ritual sacrifice performed to invoke Coatliceu's aid during difficult labors. The goddess of motherhood demanded that birth be paid for with death. Her perverse logic made family itself a battlefield. Love required violence. Protection demanded sacrifice. Every generation survived by destroying what came before. Coatlichu proved that motherhood, taken to its cosmic conclusion, becomes indistinguishable from warfare. The womb and the battlefield operate according to the same divine principles. If this is what divine motherhood looks like, the next goddess shows what divine warfare becomes when filtered through the same theological logic. In the temples of Memphis, Egyptian priests prepare for the festival of drunkenness with the nervous precision of bomb disposal experts. They're not simply organizing a religious celebration, they're reenacting humanity's near extinction to prevent its repetition. The lion-headed goddess Sekhmet has tasted blood before, and only mass intoxication keeps her from finishing what she started. The destruction of mankind, recorded in multiple Egyptian sources, describes how Ra sent Sekhmet to punish humanity for rebellion. But the lioness goddess became so intoxicated by slaughter that she couldn't stop killing. The other gods had to flood the land with beer dyed red with ochre to trick her into drinking herself unconscious before she exterminated the entire human species. The annual festival ritualized this near apocalypse through state-sponsored mass intoxication. Thousands of worshippers consumed enough alcohol to achieve what temple records call beautiful drunkenness, a level of inebriation that supposedly prevented Sekhmet from resuming her murderous rampage. Medical papyri describe the festival's aftermath. Communities paralyzed by hangovers so severe that normal economic activity ceased for days. The price of preventing human extinction was temporarily becoming too drunk to function as humans. Archaeological evidence from Sekhmet temples includes massive storage jars for beer and wine, drainage systems for vomit and other bodily waste, and medical supplies for treating alcohol poisoning. The infrastructure of worship doubled as the infrastructure of mass intoxication. But the psychological sophistication becomes clear when you realize what Sekhmet actually taught. The goddess who could destroy humanity could also be controlled by humanity's willingness to destroy itself first. The festival proved that self-destruction could be weaponized as a form of cosmic negotiation. If you were willing to annihilate your dignity, your health, and your functionality, you could temporarily pacify a goddess who wanted to annihilate your species. Imagine designing an annual holiday where your civilization reenacts its almost extinction through mass alcohol poisoning to prevent actual extinction. That's not religious devotion. That's collective trauma response institutionalized as state policy. Sekhmet transformed the threat of cosmic destruction into an annual exercise in controlled self-destruction. She proved that if you can't beat a goddess who wants to kill you, you can at least make yourself too pathetic to be worth killing. And if intoxication can be used to pacify cosmic violence, the next goddess shows how pleasure itself can be transformed into a weapon. The Nile flows thick with boats carrying thousands of pilgrims toward Bubastis, their singing echoing across the water as they strip away social conventions, mile by river mile. By the time they reach Bastit's festival, the gentle cat goddess will have overseen transformations that would scandalize any modern religious gathering. Herodotus's account of the Bubastis festival describes scenes that make Mardi Gras look restrained. Women lifting their skirts to crowds on shore, men and women coupling openly on boat decks, social hierarchy dissolved in wine and mutual exposure. The Greek historian claimed more wine was consumed during this single festival than during the rest of the year combined. Modern scholars note Herodotus's tendency towards sensationalism when describing foreign customs. But Egyptian religious texts confirm that Bastit's festivals involved the temporary suspension of normal social restrictions. Earlier forms of Bastet worship, before she evolved into the gentle house cat deity, show her as a lioness goddess whose festivals channeled the same dangerous energies as her fiercer relatives. Temple reliefs depict processions where ordinary social rules were explicitly abandoned in her honor. The psychological logic becomes clear when you understand that Bastit's festivals served as pressure valves for a highly stratified society. Once a year, slaves could mock masters, women could initiate public sexual encounters, and the rigid hierarchy that defined Egyptian daily life could be temporarily inverted. But the goddess didn't simply tolerate this chaos, she demanded it. Temple records show that communities that failed to celebrate with sufficient abandon faced her anger in the form of crop failures and disease. Bastit's perverse demand was scheduled libertinism. You had to violate social norms, not as rebellion against divine order, but as obedience to divine command. The cat goddess proved that pleasure becomes a pressure valve only when it's carefully scheduled and divinely sanctioned. She transformed erotic chaos into a tool for maintaining social stability. When sacred pleasure is restricted to specific times and places, it stops being liberation and becomes another form of control. And when pleasure becomes a form of control, the next goddess shows how that control can be exported as imperial policy. On the mountain of Eryx in Sicily, Roman soldiers climb the winding path to a temple where Venus rules over the intersection of military conquest and sexual charisma. This isn't the Venus of romantic poetry. This is Venus Erycina, the goddess who proved that erotic power could be harvested, regulated, and deployed as instrument of empire. The Temple of Venus Erycina was originally dedicated to Astarte, the Phoenician goddess of war and sexuality. When Rome conquered Sicily, they didn't destroy the cult. They rebranded it, transforming a foreign goddess into a Roman patron deity while preserving her essential function. Roman soldiers made vows to Venus Erycina before battles, understanding that her favor affected both their military success and their sexual attractiveness. The goddess who granted victory in war also granted conquests in love, and the temple served both functions simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from the Eryx temple site includes votive offerings that mix military equipment with erotic artifacts, bronze spear points dedicated alongside clay phalli, armor fragments intermingled with cosmetic containers. But the most revealing evidence comes from Roman legal documents that record the temple's economic function. Venus Erycina's sanctuary operated as a center for regulated prostitution, with the goddess collecting taxes on every transaction, and the Roman state collecting taxes on the goddess. The perverse innovation was bureaucratic. Rome learned to monetize divine sexuality, transforming erotic worship into imperial revenue stream. Your desire became taxable income for both goddess and state. Temple account records show payments made to various categories of sacred personnel, from high priestesses to women whose duties included providing sexual services to soldiers and pilgrims. The goddess of love became the CEO of a state-regulated erotic economy. Venus Erycina proved that when empire encounters foreign gods, it doesn't destroy them. It incorporates them into imperial profit structures. Your body, your desire, your worship, all become sources of revenue for cosmic and terrestrial authorities. Rome didn't just conquer, it curated its goddesses, selecting the ones whose demands could be integrated into imperial administration. And when empire learns to profit from divine submission, the final goddesses show what happens when that system reaches its ultimate conclusion. In the sacred grove on a Baltic island, Germanic tribes prepare for the arrival of Nerthus, the earth goddess whose visit brings prosperity and peace, and whose departure requires the drowning of everyone who sees her true form. This isn't metaphorical sacrifice. This is the goddess who makes silence eternal. Tacitus describes the ritual in his Germania. The goddess travels in a sacred cart, veiled from sight, accompanied by a priest who alone knows when she is present. During her procession, all weapons are put away, warfare ceases, and peace descends on the land. But when the goddess returns to her island sanctuary, the slaves who have attended her sacred cart are drowned in the lake, ensuring that no mortal can describe what they've witnessed behind the veil. Archaeological investigation of bog sites across northern Europe has uncovered preserved human remains showing evidence of ritual drowning. The victims were often bound and weighted before being submerged in sacred waters. The genius of Nerthus's demand was temporal. She offered temporary peace at the price of permanent silence. Those who facilitated her blessing could never live to describe it, speak about it, or perhaps even think about it afterward. Imagine being chosen to serve the goddess, knowing that your service would end with rope around your ankles and cold water closing over your face. Imagine watching the cart disappear into the grove and knowing you would not survive its return. Germanic tribes paid for divine peace with human lives, but those lives had to be taken in a specific way that emphasized the goddess's control over knowledge itself. She didn't just demand death, she demanded the complete erasure of witness. Nerthus proved that some divine secrets are too dangerous for human memory. Her worship required not just sacrifice, but the systematic elimination of everyone who might remember what they'd experienced. Silence here isn't metaphor. It's a body at the bottom of a lake, weighted down with stones, and the knowledge that some goddesses prefer dead witnesses to living worshippers. When divine presence becomes too dangerous for human survival, the next goddess shows how worship itself can be transformed into a form of cosmic terrorism. At crossroads throughout the Greek world, nervous families leave food offerings in the darkness and hurry away without looking back. They're feeding Hecate, the goddess of magic and liminal spaces, whose hunger for worship is matched only by her capacity for revenge against those who displease her. Official Greek religion presents Hecate as a protector goddess who guards households and assists in divine justice. She carries torches that light the way for lost travelers and keys that unlock hidden knowledge. But the archaeological record tells a darker story. Crossroads excavations have uncovered evidence of sacrificial deposits that include not just food offerings, but human hair, fingernail clippings, and other body parts associated with binding spells and curse magic. Ancient curse tablets invoke Hecate's power to destroy enemies through disease, madness, and sexual humiliation. Her worshippers didn't simply ask for protection, they weaponized her divine power against anyone who threatened them. The deipna, the monthly offering to Hecate, required families to leave food at crossroads during the new moon, then return home without looking back or speaking. Those who broke the rules, who turned around, who spoke, who showed insufficient fear, risked becoming the targets of the magic they were trying to appease. But Hecate's most perverse demand was psychological. You had to worship what you feared most. She fed on terror, grew stronger from human anxiety, and demanded that her followers cultivate their own paranoia as a form of devotion. Temple records show that communities with strong Hecate worship also had high rates of accusations of witchcraft, poisoning, and other crimes associated with magical practice. The goddess who promised protection from evil magic also multiplied the reasons to fear magical attack. Hecate transformed religious practice into cosmic extortion. You fed her because you were afraid of what she might do if you didn't, but feeding her never made you safe. It just made you more aware of how many things could go wrong. She proved that some gods prefer to be feared rather than loved, and that fear can be just as binding as devotion, sometimes more so. Some goddesses you worship in crowded festivals with music and celebration. Others you bribe in the darkness so they leave you alone. And the final goddess on our list shows what happens when the entire concept of divine feminine power is transformed into something that must be bribed, feared, and ultimately destroyed. In Mesopotamian mythology, she appears as Lilitu, a wind spirit, a night demon, a presence that disturbs sleep and steals children. By medieval Jewish folklore, she has evolved into Adam's first wife, the woman who refused to submit and was cast out of paradise for demanding equality. By Christian tradition, she has become the ultimate cautionary tale, the feminine power that answers to no one and must therefore be classified as monstrous. The archaeological record traces Lilith's transformation across millennia. Mesopotamian incantation bowls designed to trap her show her as a figure with wings and talons, dangerous but still fundamentally divine. Rabbinic literature recasts her as a rebel against divine order, the woman who chose exile rather than submission. Medieval Christian texts complete her demonization. She becomes the night hag, the child killer, the seducer of sleeping men, the embodiment of feminine sexuality that refuses masculine control. Every aspect of her original divine power is reinterpreted as evidence of evil, but analysis of the mythological progression reveals the political logic beneath her transformation. Lilith's crime wasn't violence, theft, or cruelty. Her crime was autonomy. She demanded equality with Adam, refused to be subordinated, and chose independence when equality was denied. Later, religious traditions couldn't destroy her. Her mythological power was too strong, her story too compelling. Instead, they rewrote her identity, transforming divine autonomy into demonic rebellion. The texts that demonize Lilith reveal the anxieties of the cultures that rewrote her story. She represents the possibility that feminine power might exist entirely outside masculine authority, not as daughter, wife, or mother, but as independent agent answering only to herself. Her perverse demand, from patriarchal perspective, was ontological. She demanded the right to exist without justification, without subordination, without reference to masculine approval or control. Medieval illustrations show her as a beautiful woman with wings, still attractive, still powerful, but safely categorized as demonic, so that her power can be feared rather than emulated. Lilith's story demonstrates how later religions deal with uncontrollable goddesses. When you can't dominate them, you demonize them. When you can't subordinate divine feminine power, you reclassify it as evil and make its destruction a religious obligation. When a culture can't control its goddesses, it renames them demons, and when it renames them demons, it gives itself permission to hunt them. The transformation of Lilith from goddess to demon maps the historical process by which patriarchal religions neutralize divine feminine power, not through direct confrontation, but through redefinition, demonization, and the systematic rewriting of theological history. In the royal archives of Ugarit, discovered by archaeologists at Ras Shamra in what is now coastal Syria, cuneiform tablets preserve poetry so violent that modern translators still struggle to find appropriate English equivalents for the original Ugaritic descriptions. These aren't metaphorical accounts of cosmic battles fought in abstract spiritual realms. These are detailed descriptions of a goddess who wades through human carnage with the enthusiasm most deities reserve for harvest festivals. The epic literature describes Anat in a scene of slaughter so extreme, so lovingly detailed in its accounts of creative violence, that even scholars accustomed to ancient warfare find themselves reaching for euphemisms when discussing her mythological activities with undergraduate students. She doesn't just kill her enemies, she decorates herself with their body parts as if preparing for a divine fashion show, where severed hands serve as jewelry and heads become ornamental accessories for her belt. The text describes her laughter echoing across battlefields as she transforms human beings into components of her personal adornment, arranging dismembered corpses according to aesthetic principles that prioritize divine entertainment over military necessity. But here's what makes Anat particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective. Her enthusiastic participation in mass slaughter isn't presented as a regrettable necessity or a burden she bears for the greater good. She enjoys it. The poetry makes clear that she finds genuine pleasure in the act of killing, that violence serves as a form of entertainment that satisfies appetites we normally associate with festival celebrations or romantic encounters. And this bloodthirsty goddess who delights in creative dismemberment, she's a virgin. Her chastity isn't compromised by her warrior activities. It's somehow enhanced by them, as if sexual abstinence and enthusiastic violence were complementary aspects of the same divine personality. The Ugaritic texts describe her virginity not as a limitation or a burden she bears for cosmic purposes, but as a source of power that enables rather than restricts her capacity for unlimited destruction. Her refusal of sexual relationships frees her to pursue violence without the complications that would arise from loyalty to husband or children, or romantic partners who might object to her enthusiasm for creative slaughter. Archaeological evidence from Ugaritic temple sites reveals how communities honored her dual nature through offerings that acknowledge both aspects of her personality. Weapon deposits found at her shrines include actual military equipment dedicated by warriors who had survived battles where they witnessed her divine intervention, mixed with traditional fertility offerings that suggest her worshippers understood her virginity as a form of fertility that produced death rather than life. But the theological sophistication becomes apparent when you realize that Anat represents the logical extreme of a psychological pattern that appears throughout ancient religious systems. The transformation of sexual abstinence into a weapon just as destructive as sexual indulgence. Where other goddesses demand sexual submission as proof of devotion, Anat demands the complete avoidance of sexual relationships in favor of relationships with violence that provide the same psychological satisfaction through different means. Her worshippers aren't just celebrating her military victories, they're celebrating a goddess who has discovered how to weaponize sexual frustration, how to transform the energy that normally flows into romantic relationships into fuel for creative destruction that knows no limits and acknowledges no conventional boundaries. The virgin warrior goddess demonstrates that purity and cruelty walk hand in hand when both serve as forms of power that refuse subordination to ordinary human relationships and conventional moral limitations. Anat proves that sexual abstinence can be weaponized as completely as sexual indulgence, that virginity can become just as dangerous as promiscuity when it's directed by divine authority that recognizes no limits and respects no conventional boundaries. She represents the ultimate fusion of chastity and violence, proving that some forms of purity are measured not by what you refuse to do, but by how enthusiastically you do the things that others consider unthinkable. On Irish battlefields shrouded in morning mist, three aspects of the Morrigan circle overhead in raven form, their black wings cutting through air, thick with the scent of blood and fear as they conduct the most intimate form of divine selection in Celtic mythology. These aren't abstract symbols of fate observing cosmic destiny from safe celestial distances. These are hands-on goddesses who descend to Earth to personally interview candidates for death. And their selection process involves psychological and physical encounters that blur every conventional boundary between seduction, prophecy, and supernatural assassination. Celtic literature preserved in manuscripts like the Táin Bó Cúailnge and the Acalum na Senorach describes how the Morrigan approaches heroes before crucial battles, offering sexual union that doubles as prophetic revelation and triples as spiritual examination. But this isn't romantic encounter disguised with religious significance. This is cosmic interview conducted through the most intimate possible means, where divine knowledge is transmitted through physical connection and fate is determined through sexual performance. The psychological complexity becomes apparent when you realize that the Morrigan's advances aren't motivated by desire in any recognizable sense. She seduces men who are about to die, offers intimate knowledge to warriors whose fate has already been determined, and provides sexual experiences that serve as both blessing and death sentence administered through the same divine touch. Those who accept her embraces receive detailed knowledge of their future, not just whether they'll survive the coming battle, but how they'll die, who will kill them, what their last words will be, how their bodies will be treated after death. She doesn't offer false comfort or optimistic predictions. She provides clinical accuracy delivered through intimate whispers that make prophecy feel like pillow talk conducted in the shadow of the grave. But those who refuse her advances face consequences that make death in battle look like mercy by comparison. Celtic literature describes how rejected suitors discover that the Morrigan's anger expresses itself through cosmic manipulation that makes survival impossible, regardless of skill, courage, or divine protection from other sources. Warriors who spurn her sexual offers find their weapons breaking at crucial moments, their allies abandoning them without explanation, their tactical decisions leading inevitably to disaster that could have been avoided if they had simply accepted divine intimacy when it was offered. The Morrigan's genius lies in making wisdom contingent upon accepting your own destruction. You can learn what you need to know to make informed decisions about your fate, but only if you're willing to surrender your body to a goddess whose embrace guarantees that the knowledge you gain will be useless for extending your life. She offers cosmic insight, but only to those who prove they're worthy of divine attention, by accepting that divine attention comes with a price that makes the knowledge itself irrelevant for practical purposes. Irish mythological cycles show heroes wrestling with this impossible dilemma across generations. Remain ignorant and potentially survive through luck and skill, or gain complete cosmic knowledge at the price of certain doom, administered by the same divine hands that offered enlightenment. The sophistication of her psychological operation becomes clear when you realize that the Morrigan doesn't just predict death, she creates the circumstances that make her predictions accurate. Her prophecies become self-fulfilling through divine manipulation that ensures compliance with cosmic destiny she herself has determined. She represents the ultimate fusion of knowledge and destruction, proving that some forms of wisdom are literally fatal, that cosmic truth can be too dangerous for human survival, and that divine love and divine murder can be indistinguishable when administered by supernatural authority that operates according to logic mortals can't comprehend or challenge. When a goddess can seduce and sentence you in the same breath, when divine knowledge requires intimate submission to forces that plan your destruction, free will becomes not just negotiable, but completely irrelevant to cosmic outcomes determined by power that transcends human choice. The Morrigan proves that some gods prefer to be intimate with their victims before killing them, and that the most terrifying divine relationships are the ones that feel most personal while serving purposes that have nothing to do with human welfare or cosmic justice. Along the banks of the Osun River, in what is now southwestern Nigeria, devotees gather at dawn to honor Osun, the Orisha whose golden beauty mirrors the honey she controls, and whose temperament can shift from nurturing mother to terrifying destroyer, faster than summer storms sweep across the African landscape. They carry offerings of honey dripped into brass bowls, mirrors that catch and reflect sunlight like captured fragments of her divine radiance, and yellow fabrics that flutter in the morning breeze like prayers made visible. This is Osun at her most accessible, the sweet goddess of rivers, fertility, and prosperity, whose laughter bubbles like stream water over polished stones, and whose presence transforms the harsh realities of subsistence farming into something approaching paradise on earth. In Yoruba religious tradition, Osun appears as everything beautiful and life-giving about divine femininity. She controls the fresh water that makes agriculture possible, the honey that sweetens bitter medicine, the gold that represents prosperity and divine favor. Her worship involves offerings that celebrate abundance. Honey poured into rivers, mirrors positioned to catch her reflection, beautiful objects that acknowledge her role as patron of everything aesthetically pleasing in human experience. Traditional praise songs celebrate her generosity with language that makes her sound like the perfect combination of loving mother and benevolent queen. She provides for her children, protects women during childbirth, ensures that marriages produce healthy children, and that communities prosper through her divine intervention. But oral traditions preserved by religious practitioners across West Africa and the diaspora also contain stories of Osun's capacity for devastating punishment when disrespected, ignored, or taken for granted. And these aren't gentle corrections designed to teach moral lessons through mild discomfort. Communities that pollute her rivers don't just face water shortages. They face droughts so severe that the land becomes uninhabitable, forcing entire populations to abandon territories their families have occupied for generations. The goddess of sweet water can make water itself disappear, leaving nothing but cracked earth and dying vegetation as monuments to human disrespect. Individuals who mock her sweetness, who mistake her kindness for weakness or her generosity for unlimited tolerance, discover that honey can become poison when administered by divine hands that have lost patience with human stupidity and ingratitude. Traditional accounts describe the physical and psychological consequences of earning Osun's displeasure with disturbing precision. Illnesses that resist all treatment, relationships that collapse without explanation, financial prosperity that evaporates overnight as if it had never existed. But the most sophisticated aspect of Osun's psychological operation is how she makes her followers complicit in their own potential punishment. Every offering made to ensure her continued favor carries the implicit acknowledgement that withdrawal of that favor would be catastrophic. Every honey poured into her rivers reminds the devotee that sweetness can be withdrawn. Every mirror offered to her beauty reflects the possibility that beauty can become terrifying when it serves divine rather than human purposes. Every golden ornament acknowledges that prosperity exists only at her discretion and can be reclaimed according to cosmic logic that mortals don't control. Traditional Yoruba practices include elaborate rituals designed to maintain proper relationship with Osun's power, ceremonies that balance appreciation for her gifts with awareness of her potential for destruction. These aren't just celebrations of divine bounty, but careful negotiations with cosmic forces that could withdraw their support at any moment. The psychological sophistication becomes clear when you understand that Osun teaches divine relationships as permanent anxiety management. You celebrate her sweetness while constantly monitoring your behavior for signs of disrespect. You enjoy her gifts while remaining aware that enjoyment itself might be interpreted as taking her generosity for granted. She offers abundance and beauty and prosperity, but always with the understanding that these gifts come with strings attached to divine temperament that operates according to standards mortals can't fully understand or predict. The honey that sweetens your life today can become the poison that destroys your tomorrow, administered by the same divine hands that offered blessing, according to cosmic justice that acknowledges no appeals and provides no second chances. Osun perfects the art of making divine favor feel like ongoing negotiation with beautiful, terrible, unpredictable power that could choose to love or destroy you based on criteria too complex for human comprehension. By now, we've traced a pattern that spans every continent and every form of human religious expression. Desire, fear, and control braided into divine authority that makes love and terror indistinguishable aspects of the same cosmic system. In the earlier layers of Greek mythology, before Roman poets rewrote her narrative to serve imperial propaganda, and before later Christian writers transformed her into a simple monster story, Medusa existed as something far more complex and psychologically disturbing. A priestess of Athena whose transformation from sacred servant to lethal creature reveals the systematic way that ancient religious systems transformed victims into scapegoats and made female suffering appear cosmically necessary. The archaic versions of her myth, preserved in fragments that predate the more familiar narrative popularized by Ovid and other Roman writers, describe Medusa as a woman whose beauty made her worthy to serve in Athena's most sacred temple, whose dedication to the virgin goddess was so complete that she had sworn oaths of celibacy that bound her entire life to divine service. This wasn't casual religious participation or part-time devotional activity. According to the early sources, Medusa had surrendered her sexuality, her independence, her possibilities for marriage and family, everything that normally defined women's lives in ancient Greek society, to serve a goddess who demanded complete chastity from her most trusted servants. But her beauty, the same physical perfection that had qualified her for sacred service, attracted the attention of Poseidon, the sea god whose divine status placed him beyond human law, and whose appetites acknowledged no limitations imposed by mortal concepts of consent or religious sanctuary. The mythological accounts describe how Poseidon violated Athena's priestess inside the virgin goddess's own temple, transforming the sacred space dedicated to chastity into a crime scene that contaminated the very foundations of divine worship through sexual violence administered by divine authority. But here's where the psychological sophistication of the mythological system reveals itself. Athena's response to discovering that her priestess had been sexually assaulted in her own sanctuary wasn't to punish the god who had committed the crime or to provide protection and healing for the victim of divine sexual violence. Instead, she transformed the victim into a creature so hideous that anyone who looked upon her would immediately turn to stone, ensuring that Medusa's suffering would continue for eternity, while Poseidon faced no consequences for his actions. The goddess of wisdom and justice responded to sexual assault in her temple by punishing the woman who had been assaulted and allowing the male god who had committed the crime to return to his normal divine activities without facing any form of cosmic justice or divine accountability. The transformation wasn't presented as punishment for Medusa's actions. Even the earliest sources acknowledged that she had been a victim rather than a willing participant. It was presented as necessary cosmic correction, as if the contamination of the temple required the removal of the contaminated priestess rather than the punishment of the god whose actions had caused the contamination. But the theological logic becomes even more twisted when you realize how the transformation itself operated as ongoing punishment that exceeded any reasonable response to the original crime. Medusa's gaze became lethal, not because she had gained dangerous divine power, but because her beauty had been transformed into a weapon that killed anyone who attempted to look at her. The face that had once inspired desire and worship became a source of immediate death for anyone who tried to see her, ensuring that she would spend eternity in complete isolation, unable to interact with any living being without causing their immediate destruction. Every human relationship became impossible, every social connection was severed, every possibility for companionship, comfort, or human contact was eliminated through divine transformation that made her very existence lethal to others. Later, mythological traditions completed her transformation from victim to monster by making her death at Perseus's hands a heroic rather than tragic act. The woman who had been punished for another's crime became the monster whose destruction was celebrated as evidence of heroic courage and divine justice. The psychological sophistication of the complete mythological cycle reveals how religious narratives can be systematically rewritten to transform victims into villains, making their suffering appear not just justified, but necessary for cosmic order and human safety. Medusa's story demonstrates the process by which patriarchal religious systems neutralize the threat posed by female victimization. First, by making the victim, rather than the perpetrator, responsible for the consequences of male violence, then by transforming her suffering into cosmic necessity, and finally by making her destruction appear heroic rather than tragic. When the wronged woman becomes the monster whose death is celebrated, the story stops being mythology and starts resembling policy designed to manage the psychological and social consequences of systematic male violence against women. The transformation of Medusa from priestess to monster to celebrated victim represents one of the most sophisticated examples of how mythological narratives can be used to normalize violence against women by making their suffering appear cosmically necessary and their destruction cosmically justified. In caves carved from volcanic rock across the ancient Mediterranean, at Cumae overlooking the Bay of Naples, at Delphi on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, at Erythrae on the coast of Asia Minor, women sit alone in sulphurous darkness, breathing vapors that rise from geological fissures in the earth and slowly, inevitably, systematically destroy their bodies while opening their minds to divine communication that transforms them into living bridges between mortal ignorance and cosmic knowledge. These are the Sibyls, the prophetic priestesses whose gifts came at a price that makes every other sacrifice we've examined look almost merciful by comparison. Because while other goddesses demanded specific acts of submission or degradation or violence that could be completed and survived, the Sibyls faced a form of divine service that consumed their entire lives, their bodies, their possibilities for human happiness, transforming them into oracles whose prophetic abilities grew stronger as their humanity gradually dissolved. The ancient sources, Virgil, Ovid, Pliny, and others, describe the physical toll of Sibylline prophecy with clinical precision that makes it impossible to romanticize the supernatural gifts that made these women among the most influential figures in the ancient world. The convulsions that accompanied divine possession weren't brief episodes that left the oracle refreshed and enlightened. They were violent physical ordeals that left permanent damage, seizures so severe that witnesses described them as evidence that the human body wasn't designed to channel divine knowledge without suffering consequences that accumulated over time. The exhaustion that followed prophetic trances wasn't temporary fatigue that could be cured with rest and nutrition. It was systemic depletion that aged the oracles decades in the span of months, draining their physical vitality to fuel supernatural insights that political and military leaders considered essential for making decisions that affected entire civilizations. The most detailed accounts come from descriptions of the Cumaean Sibyl, whose mythology reveals the ultimate horror of divine service that extends beyond normal human lifespan. According to tradition preserved across multiple sources, she had been granted immortal life by Apollo in exchange for her prophetic service, but the god had deliberately omitted eternal youth from the divine bargain. The result was centuries of aging without the mercy of death, gradual physical deterioration that continued until she withered to nothing but a voice preserved in a jar, still delivering prophecies but no longer possessing a body capable of independent existence or normal human experience. Picture the psychological horror, consciousness persisting through the complete dissolution of physical form, awareness trapped in a container where it continues to serve divine purposes while being completely severed from every aspect of human experience that makes existence meaningful or tolerable. But the Sibyl's isolation wasn't just physical, it was comprehensive social and emotional exile that began the moment they accepted their prophetic calling. Roman authorities, understanding that divine knowledge represented political power too dangerous for unrestricted circulation, carefully controlled access to Sibylline prophecies through bureaucratic systems that treated the oracles themselves as state-controlled resources rather than independent religious figures. The women who generated the knowledge that shaped imperial policy, military strategy, and religious practice throughout the ancient world lived as prisoners of their own supernatural gifts. They couldn't marry, couldn't have children, couldn't form the personal relationships that provide meaning and comfort to ordinary human existence. Every prophetic vision isolated them further from normal human experience. Every divine revelation made them more valuable to the political authorities who controlled their access to the outside world, and less capable of relating to ordinary people whose lives weren't dominated by supernatural obligations. The Sibyl's perverse sacrifice was temporal as well as physical. They surrendered not just their bodies and their freedom, but their entire futures, their possibilities for love, family, friendship, personal happiness, everything that makes human existence psychologically sustainable over the course of a normal lifetime. And in exchange for this comprehensive surrender, they received divine knowledge that they couldn't control, couldn't refuse, and couldn't use for their own benefit. They became channels for cosmic information that others would interpret, gatekeep, and deploy according to political necessity rather than the oracle's personal welfare or spiritual development. The final irony becomes clear when you realize that these sacred women, who supposedly held positions of ultimate religious authority, were actually the most thoroughly controlled figures in the entire ancient religious system. They generated the prophecies that determined imperial policy, but they had no say in how those prophecies were interpreted or applied. They possessed knowledge of future events, but they couldn't use that knowledge to improve their own circumstances or escape from the divine service that was systematically destroying their bodies and minds. They were consulted by kings and generals as if they possessed ultimate spiritual authority, but they lived in caves, isolated from human society, their every moment controlled by religious and political authorities, who treated them as oracular machines rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and care. The circle closes exactly where it began. Sacred women presented as gatekeepers of cosmic wisdom, but whose lives become collateral in systems of divine authority that are actually controlled by temporal powers that exploit religious authority. 4. Political purposes. The Sibyls represent the ultimate evolution of the pattern we've traced through 30 cases. Women whose supposed spiritual power masks their complete powerlessness, whose divine authority disguises their total subjugation, whose sacred status becomes the justification for forms of exploitation that would be considered criminal if they weren't dressed up as religious necessity. They traded their bodies, their lives, their freedom, their futures, and their humanity for knowledge that men would gatekeep, interpret, package, and deploy according to political necessity that served everyone except the women who had sacrificed everything to generate the supernatural insights that kept empires functioning. From Inanna's ritual humiliation in Mesopotamian ziggurats to the Sibyl's prophetic imprisonment in Mediterranean caves, we've traced a pattern that spans 3,000 years and 6 continents. These weren't random cultural accidents or isolated expressions of religious creativity. They were iterations of the same system: desire, fear, and control, fused into divine authority that could demand anything and justify everything. Not symbols floating in celestial realms, but systems, blueprints for organizing human societies around the systematic violation of human dignity, coded as religious obligation and enforced through divine terror. What we've discovered isn't perversion in the modern sense. These goddesses represent the anxieties, desires, and control mechanisms of the societies that created them. Every impossible demand they made reflected a very earthly anxiety about power, sexuality, death, and social order. Cybele's castration requirement, a civilization's terror of uncontrolled masculine sexuality. Tanit's child sacrifices, a culture's willingness to sacrifice anything to maintain divine protection. Sekhmet's alcoholic pacification, a society that understood self-destruction as cosmic negotiation. When we call these goddesses perverted, we are really identifying the societies that found these demands not only tolerable, but necessary for cosmic order. The pattern reveals that what we consider progress, the idea that religious devotion shouldn't require the destruction of human dignity, is historically aberrant. For most of human history, divine authority and human suffering were understood as naturally compatible. These goddesses mirror our own unresolved questions. Whose fears are being written into our contemporary stories? What impossible standards do our current authorities demand? What forms of submission do we normalize as devotion? The ancient world ended, but the psychology that created these goddesses continues in different forms. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental pattern, power justified through the eroticization of submission and suffering, remains recognizable. Perhaps the most unsettling revelation isn't that ancient peoples worshipped goddesses who demanded impossible things, but that we still live in systems that operate according to similar logic, just with different masks and more sophisticated justifications. The goddesses are gone. The pattern continues.